meeting to order. Dr. Cash, will you lead us?
Please stand. Ready? Begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Buenas noches y bienvenidos. Tenemos interpretación al español disponible.
Thank you. We do have headsets for the hearing impaired. Dr. Cash, introductions, proclamations, presentations, recognition.
Don't have any this evening.
Okay. Any board comments or correspondence? Okay. No closed session action was taken. Any public comments? I don't think these are public comments. We're going to go right into the conference agenda, which is a discussion of facilities master plan. And I know I have two speaker slips here, but the reality is this is more of a discussion workshop. You can come up, Dr. Ebenstein or Mr. Capps, and just take the podium and let us know what's on your mind and what your thoughts are, and you can have as much time as you want. No 3-minute clock.
Are you starting then the discussion?
Just discussion, what you have on your mind, and
Mr. President, may I start?
Yes.
Sure. In late 2013, the board approved the contract for LPA to begin their work in conjunction with district staff to create a district facilities master plan. And the goals of that work were pretty straightforward. To conduct a needs assessment, and that was really primarily to familiarize themselves with the Teleco needs assessment that had been conducted earlier that year. Number two, identify educational program standards, which was to take a look at what we currently have as educational programs in 3 distinct areas: TK to 6, grades 7 to 8, and then grades 9 to 12. And then provide us with a comparison of what we're doing as compared to what's happening around our region, around the state, and around the nation in relationship to educational standards. They then would review current enrollment, our demographics, and conduct a capacity analysis. And they would work with school sites on the functionality of spaces for identified current educational programs and also for 21st century educational programs. And that means they would look at classrooms, they'd look at the support rooms that we've identified for students that have special needs, they would look at our administrative spaces, they'd look at our library media centers, they'd look at our spaces for community use, they'd look at our spaces for physical education, for food services, our multi-purpose rooms. The fifth goal was to identify and locate community use spaces as part of the strategic plan and on each of the campus. Places which our community could access and use, not only to facilitate conversations between parents and students, but just members of the community that may not have students. And last, to identify health and safety areas. And the primary areas they looked at were lighting, pathways, ADA, gates, and fences. They've met with each school principal several times. They've met with each site team several times. They've conducted several town hall meetings. I think board members, most of you, either attended one or all of them. And then they also facilitated the district master planning committee meetings, of which we had approximately 1 per month. As a result of all of that, and throughout that process, they developed draft master space plans that you have before you. And those are draft plans, unlike plans that you might have seen for other spaces that the district has been engaged in looking at. And at a meeting in December, it was requested by Dr. Ebenstein, who's here tonight, that a different approach be taken. And this was at the December Facilities Master Planning meeting. And that approach, as I'm sure he'll provide more detail and probably say it more eloquently than me, so please, Lanny, if I misspeak, correct me, was based on the idea of looking at a potential 2016 bond measure to support facilities improvements for students in the Santa Barbara Unified School District. In conversations I've had with Dr. Ebenstein, and through his request to place this item before the board, we're here this evening. I look forward tonight, after hearing from Dr. Ebenstein and Mr. Capps and anyone else who's here to speak, or in the near future, for hearing from the board on whether we would continue down the path of creating the comprehensive long-range facilities plan that LPA has taken us to, or we would have a more focused plan moving forward toward the next 10 years, one that Dr. Ebenstein has recommended. One of the things I'm most thankful for, and I don't know that any one of us can say this too often, is that we have community members that are interested in and invested in the well-being of our children and the future of our community. And I want to thank Dr. Ebenstein for being here tonight and being one of those interested community members to help us as a community and help the board provide input and direction to staff on what we would do next in relationship to the development of our facilities master plan. So with that, Mr. President, I hope that was a sufficient enough introduction.
Do the board members have any questions or comments before we go further? Ms. Parker?
When is LPA due to come and present themselves to the board?
As soon as you tell me.
But, I mean, obviously, what we've been seeing are just the space schematics.
Correct.
Is their report ready?
Not yet.
Okay.
Their process was interrupted so the board could engage in this recommendation and give direction to staff.
Okay, thank you.
So how far along are they in making their master plan presentation?
How far along would you say? Mr. Coltrip's here. How far along would you say? Why don't you come up to the podium?
Thank you. Dr. Cash, board members, thank you for having me this evening. LPA's process consists of about, as Dr. Cash said, roughly monthly meetings for about 10 or 11 months, at which time they would put together a draft plan, and that was due to you in January before we, as Dr. Cash mentioned, interrupted the process. And so upon re-energizing it or getting it moving again, it could be ready to go in 30 days for you to have a draft. It would be understood that you would then review the draft, have comments back and forth, and then a final presentation would be forthcoming in about a month after that. So about 60 days to a final from now.
Okay, I had no idea we had stopped them in their tracks. I mean, I had no knowledge of that, so I'm surprised.
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
I tried to express that in correspondence, but I inartfully must have expressed that.
Okay, yeah, okay. Dr. Ebenstein, do you want to just come up? Any of you who are going to talk or come up, just feel free to join in. And this is just a conversation.
Well, thank you, President Herron and members of the board, Dr. Cash. I really appreciate the opportunity to offer some words. This is a really important issue, and it's something that merits a lot of conversation and consideration. And frankly, and I'll talk a little bit more from my heart, and a little bit less academic than is my always my first impression. So first of all, I want to say, Dr. Cash, I really appreciate that you've started this process early in terms of we don't have a situation where we've got to make a decision in the next 3 months in terms of, because the master planning process started in 2014, we really have the remainder of 2015 and even into 2016 before something would be finalized for to be placed on the ballot, and that's positive. So I really appreciate that. And I should say too that it was the consensus of the committee, and some of the other committee members are here, that we thought it would be worthwhile to consider some other approaches. And I won't dwell on that, but it's something that it was a commonly held view on the committee. To give some basic background, okay, I went today and looked up how much money have the school districts spent on bonds since 1995, and the answer is $208 million. In terms of that's what we've passed in bonds. We passed in '95 an elementary bond for $6 million for Roosevelt. In '98 we passed an elementary bond for $25 million. In 2000 for the elementary district. In 2000, we passed a bond for $67 million for the secondary district. In 2010, we then passed a bond of $75 million for the secondary district and $35 million for the elementary district. So all told, we've taxed $142 million for the secondary school district. It's a lot of money, $142 million for the secondary district in two bonds in 2000 and 2010. It's about $20 million a site. In terms of in the secondary district, that would be a figure that we could approximate. You know, as just a member of the community, does it look to me like all of our junior highs and high schools have had $20 million spent on them? I don't know in terms of, and the answer truly is I don't know. And in the elementary district, we've spent $66 million on bonds in that point in time, during that time period. And, you know, once again, that's a lot of money. And I think there's a real concern on the part of the community that these funds could be spent better than they've been spent in terms of, in the past, ballot arguments or ballot, the proposals have been worded very generally in terms of the district's been able to do almost whatever it would want with the funds. And some of the key items that were in bonds then didn't come to pass. So it's something that, and some of that's inevitable, but we've never really had, that I can recall, and there have been reports, but in terms of really to try to say, the school district would like to go to the community for some more money, what's the community gotten for its $208 million thus far? So I would hope that before there were too much more of a process, that we would have much more specificity on where did that $142 million in the secondary district go? And it's something that I think that would be very useful. With respect to where do we go from here, I think that real consideration should be given to a more narrow and targeted bond. And that's so for a couple of reasons. The first is that the political climate on government spending in general, I would say, and on school bonds in particular, has changed locally. And both the Santa Barbara City College bond and the Montecito bond were off 20 to 25 percentage points from earlier levels of support without much opposition. And I think that gives, and campaigns, you know, relatively strong campaigns being run on their behalf. Certainly that was the case in the City College case. Basically, I think the bottom line is a lot of people just are uncertain about what they're going to be getting for their, their expenditures. So once again, to try to get a better idea of what the funding has been spent on in the past would be really helpful. With looking to the forward, looking forward to the future, I think that the single most significant facilities need in the districts overall, and this would be the point that I hope people would really consider, is that we have a long time shortage of elementary permanent facilities in our community in terms of most of our elementary schools have lots of portables on them, and particularly for smaller sites in terms of Peabody has 16 portables on it, Adams has 17 portables on it, Franklin, including Children's Center, has 16 portables on it, Washington has, I believe, 11 portables on it, Cleveland has either 8 or 9 portables on it. The point is that across the elementary district, Adams, and it's something that, and that's just how they've looked forever. And the point is, the reason is because many years ago, under different people, schools were closed and then sold. And then when the enrollments grew again, well, we've just got to put more kids on our existing elementary sites, and therefore, we'll just put more portables on them. I think the district should recognize that as a long-term goal and simply say, we're going to have a bond that's going to get rid of the portables on our elementary school sites. And if it really isn't that specific in terms of if there's any flexibility, wiggle room, all that kind of stuff, I just don't think it'll happen in terms of if there are, what's typically happened in past bonds is that many things go on a list. There are some cost estimates for some of them, for most of them. The lists change a lot in terms of various iterations of them during the process. What's finally being put on the ballot, I think people would have a real hard time saying exactly specifically what it is. And then in terms of what the phasing is of projects and the expenditures, things that have been said would be parts of bonds turned out not to be parts of bonds. So that if there is that sort of flexibility, I don't think that the removal of the portables would happen. And I think that would be unfortunate in terms of this may be our last chance for a bond for a long time. Historically, that's kind of how it's gone in terms of you have eras where you have bonds and then you have decades where you don't. Do we really want to have it's 96, it's 96 counting the children's centers, do we really want to have 80 or 70 portables on our sites for the next 20 or 30 years? And the thing is, I really don't, in terms of it's something that, and it's something that we need, I think, to develop a process whereby we remove the elementary portables from the sites. And as I tried to indicate on the letter that I sent you, that would be something like $80 million. In other words, to replace 78 build 78 new classrooms across the elementary district. $1 million a portable is about, a classroom is about what it's costing these days with site development expenses, portable bathrooms, portable storage units, all that kind of stuff. Even if that figure is slightly high, it's probably not high by much. So the point is that, it's probably $80 million, something along those lines, particularly with relatively modest health and safety items that the master plan committee had identified. So it's something that I think that would be a great bond for the Santa Barbara Elementary School District in terms of, it might not be the perfect bond, might not solve all problems forever, but it would mean that 20 years from now, when school boards are meeting, they're not going to be continuing to meet with something like 96 portables on their sites. And for what it's worth, and once again, I would guess most people didn't catch this because, once again, there's so much documentation that comes out. Sometimes you don't get the details. But one of the recommendations from the consultants was that we'd leave all portables on sites that were 25 years or less in terms of, that was one of the frameworks within which they were operating. That wasn't even something that was necessarily discussed at the committee, but just sort of, a framework that was put forward. And I don't think that's the standard that we want for Santa Barbara, that portables that are, if it's only been there for 20 years, we can leave it there for another 20 or 30 years in terms of, I think the time has come to say this is what we're going to do. And so that would be my strong encouragement on that. Okay. With respect to enrollment, and is something that it really is enrollment that drives considerations. And as you'll see from the correspondence I sent, and I'm sorry.
Before you go on to enrollment, let me just take an opportunity to ask the board. You've hit one topic so far.
Yeah.
And since this is a work process, and if you're open to questions by the board, if anyone has them or comments on what you've talked about so far.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Adelson?
I had a question, maybe Dr. Cash can answer. So of the portables mentioned, how many are 25 years or less? I didn't see that.
Unfortunately, I know the figures the other way.
Oh, okay.
How many are, I think, 30 or 40 years and old? Dave can go get that, though. I think we obviously have the age of every portable but a couple, because they're so old none of us were born when we put them on our campus.
Okay.
Other comments? I'm going to take an issue.
Sure.
Maybe I'm too deep into the woods, but as far as I'm concerned, when we were talking about the latest bonds, we went in great detail as to what the needs were. In fact, before the vote was taken by the public, we had a priority list of what we were going to do. Very detailed, and that was the people who put the arguments for the bond forward insisted that we tell the public what we were going to do. And so we voted on that before the election, if I recall correctly. And I see Ms. Cordero shaking her head yes back there. And we've done exactly that. The priority list we created is in the process of being completed, and we have extremely detailed numbers that we presented a couple meetings ago showing exactly where the dollars went and how they were spent and what stage we are in. So I take issue with the fact that the public didn't know what we were going to do and that we didn't do what we said we were going to do. I'm not talking about previous bonds because I know nothing about them. I'm just talking about the bonds that we passed. I think we were very specific. In fact, we complimented staff at the last meeting or 2 meetings ago on what a great job they have done doing exactly what this board has asked us to do. I'm happy to go over all that with you and show you, or Dr. Cash can show you.
Great.
But I take issue with that one part of your comments. I agree we need a narrow and targeted if we go forward future, but we need to determine what that narrow and targeted is. And what you're giving us is very good information.
Well, thank you, Mr. I appreciate that very much. And once again, I think that would be good information to share. And as I said, my perspective is somewhat shaped from a longer time frame in terms of, and might even be disproportionately from more years ago than recently. So it's something that I think that to this point, and I know that the district has had with measures Q and R, reports on what was spent to which item and so forth. And it would be great to go through what the original statements were on the ballot and all that kind of stuff, and then exactly what's been funded. And to the extent that that's consistent, that would be positive, and I'm all in favor of that. So, I really am. So it's something that, as I said, these are, as I said at the beginning, more from the heart rather than academic, or impressionistic comments. So looking forward, is that particularly if that's the case, once again, to target and say, this is how we want to spend the money, I don't think there's any higher priority than replacing the portables on the elementary sites on a long-term basis. From having also been to the secondary sites, it's just, they're not as many on many of the sites, and the sites are so much larger, and it's just, it's not the issue where school after school, the point is that Monroe, Adams, Peabody, Washington, Franklin, Cleveland, McKinley, the point is they're all just loaded with portables, and the point is only Roosevelt really doesn't have any. Harding only has 4, but it's such a small site, the way it's divided up, it's something that it's not, I mean, that situation is also problematic. So I agree with you. If there's something to do with that, that'd be good. Now, with respect to enrollment, and this is really the crucial issue, and from having looked at the birth data both at Cottage Hospital and in the state of California and the county of Santa Barbara and the United States, births really went down starting in 2009 at the beginning of the recession, went down 2010, 2011, 2012. They've recovered a little bit modestly in 2013 and 14. But I also saw a chart recently that California continues, or at least as of 2013, I guess was the most recent data, to have the lowest birth rate, not number of births, but birth rate since the Great Depression. In terms of, it's just a different scene, and there's going to be fewer students in schools starting in another year or two, and then for 4 or 5 years after that, and then plateauing at a lower level than we've been accustomed to. And I think that in our local case, that's the situation, not just because of fewer births, but also the housing issues really are having impact now in a way that I haven't felt they've had an impact earlier. As probably most of the members of the board know, I've historically emphasized births as driving the enrollment train, which I think is true, and indicated that growth and those sorts of factors weren't as important. I think that now the cost of housing issues with college students moving into apartments that families would formerly be in, and housing purchase being so far out of line for families that the district is going to have 10 to 15% fewer students than it's had in the long run, and that's something very, very important to consider. So for those reasons, I think that there's strong argument to consider emphasizing the elementary district and taking care of that long-range problem. The consultant proposals that have come to this point have been, and once again, from not having seen the current space schematics, it's something that would be, for example, new buildings of 5,000 square feet or so for art, music, science, computer lab, things like that. And to put 6 or 8 of those on sites and leave all the portables there, or most of them that aren't, that are 25 years or old, only take the ones that are 25 years or older off, I think that wouldn't be the right direction for the district, and it's something that I think that the portables would be the top priority. Other things that I think we really need. So basically, I think we need to have a better idea, both recently and perhaps particularly also further away, back in time, where have we spent the $208 million in terms of, that's something that would be good to generate. That we should look at, consider just an elementary bond, that we should look at what enrollment is likely to be. We also need a facilities inventory, and to some extent this is in progress and been developed to some extent, but not that I've seen, and that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It's just to say not that I've seen, as far as what's flexible on our sites now in terms of there's some administrative programs, and there are some community programs, there are some county education programs, but there's some flexibility where they're located. And in looking toward a long-term plan of how many classrooms do you want to cite, that's information that would be beneficial to have. So if we had a more detailed facilities inventory, I think that would be very helpful. I'm going to mention 2 other ones as well. I think that we need to have then in time a detailed plan for each site. In other words, this is what the site would look like. This is what Monroe School would look like with 6 more permanent classrooms. This is where we put them. This is what Peabody School would look like with 13 more permanent classrooms. This is where we're going to put them. And then a dollar amount that would be budgeted for those amounts. And it's something that I think the schematics are really important, because many people feel that just we haven't located our portable classrooms and some of the other classrooms as well as they could have been in the past on the district in terms of, and if we're going to make decisions for the long run, we really want to make sure that those classrooms are positioned well. I think that there might be some merit to some more 2-story construction. Some of the sites, particularly Peabody, I would say, is a site that is a small site, and it's worked out well at Roosevelt. There's some limitations on a second floor, but not many. And once again, I can remember when Peabody was completely open on its perimeter. Now it's completely closed, and it's something that I hope we do better than that for the next 30 years in terms of, so that I think we need to have detailed plans for each site. I would consider the National Guard Armory in Hidden Valley in terms of if there were a bond in the secondary district. It's something that there's a number of people in the community, and I'm one of them, who thinks that from a long-range perspective, looking 50 years, 100 years, 150 years, that it would be tremendous for the community if that site could come into the public domain, and it may cost money. In terms of, might cost tens of millions of dollars, build the National Guard a site somewhere else, and to be able to make that happen. And it's something that if we're going to have a secondary bond, then maybe that should be part of it, in terms of that's something that would really do something in the long run for the district. Is one that I would continue to mention. The Hidden Valley site as well. That was one of the major things that was promised to the community in one of the bonds. It was the 1998 elementary bond, and that's another. It's something that was going to be to build a school at Hidden Valley, and the community approved that bond. But ultimately, it wasn't built because it turned out that the financial projections weren't accurate, so the funds were spent somewhere else. That plan was going to be for a neighborhood elementary school and then 2 Santa Barbara Charter and OAS. My own feeling is that rather than building portable classrooms on a junior high site and putting permanent construction there, what would it cost to build a small school on the Hidden Valley site in terms of, that would be a real addition to our community's educational infrastructure. And it's something that, in the same way that I think the National Guard Armory should be considered more thoughtfully, I think the Hidden Valley site should be considered more thoughtfully. Now, maybe neither of those will ultimately come to pass, but it's something that, and that's going to be kind of my final point, is that it's going to take many hours to make good decisions on this in terms of, and many hours, I mean, members of the board may have to spend many hours going around to sites with members of the community and saying, what is it that we really want to see on these campuses for the long run? And it's something that from a district level area too, in terms of it's something that's going to take a lot of time in terms of, if you want to go to the public and ask them for $80 million, the point is that that's something that should be really specific. This is what the funding is going to be spent on. So that I would hope that this workshop would be, facilities workshop would be the first of a number, in that over time, or a regular agenda item once a month, just facilities update in terms of going to the community, or maybe going to the community for a significant amount. That's something that's worth regularly being on the agenda, so that people can come down and talk to you about it. I know it's an issue that I and others are going to be very interested in, and we hope that we'll be able to continue to have access to district personnel and to members of the board in talking about these ideas. It's something that, look at the beautiful schools that our community once built, in terms of, and it really is, tremendous that our community once built this. Why can't we do this anymore, in terms of what have we done in recent decades that is at all comparable to what was done in the past? And my guess is it's that because the people who were there, they spent a lot more time on it, in terms of, it was something where there really were detailed plans and very specific ideas before these proposals went forward, and then very targeted expenditures. So with all of those comments, I've gone on here for about 25 minutes. So I thank you very much for your time. And as I said, it's something that I think is, it's excellent, Dr. Cash, that the process is starting at this point in time, and I genuinely hope that we can focus on, particularly in the elementary district, resolving its long-term issue of portables. And with the secondary district, there isn't the crying need in terms of the portable issue isn't as difficult, and there are other issues, but then it gets into what's maintenance and what is capital. So it's something that's an issue that deserves more consideration, and I hope you'll be receptive to more community involvement in these issues in the coming weeks, months, and years. Thank you very much.
Now, Dr. Liebenstein, you were on the Master Plan District Committee, right?
Yes, that's true.
So you say we need to have plans specifically by site. Isn't that what that process was going through? It here's a site, and here's what's there now, and here's what we suggest going to be there?
To some extent, in terms of at the final meeting, and once again, other members may have slightly different memories, but we were presented with the 21 site plans, and then we were then told that we should mark what we really liked with green dots, what we didn't like with red dots, what we really thought was great with a star. There might have been a couple other things like that, or something like that, and for me, the point is that I'm not able to evaluate, and there's about 21 sites in the district, I'm not able to evaluate 21 site plans, in 10 or 15 minutes and then start voting on them. And the committee had received some preliminary plans at some previous meetings, but then they were subsequently changed and that sort of stuff. And it's something that it would be terrific to see the space schematics that have now been presented, because that would give me a better idea. But it's something that, I think that's something that the process could result in, but it's something that, I look at it like with meetings of the Board of Education, which is that those are documents that people should get, a week in advance, so they can look at, they can talk to people, they can get a better idea, that sort of thing. And then, really have questions answered, such as which portables are we going to replace and which not. So it's something that, and as I said, the focus in the elementary district was these 5,000 square foot or so buildings on the elementary sites for those other functions, and not portables. And it's something that, that wasn't my impression of the direction that the many people in the community wanted to go.
Mr. Capps, you want to?
Sure. Just briefly. Thank you, board members, Dr. Cash. Thanks to Lanny, my friend here. I can keep my comments very brief. He certainly said everything that I would hope to say, and I agree very much with his points, particularly about a facilities bond that, were we to float one now or any time in the future, should definitely put taking care of the portables at the top of the list in priority. And I say this as a graduate of Santa Barbara High School and Roosevelt School, and I grew up in the portables. I taught at Washington School. I taught in the portables. My son attended Washington School in the portables. He is now at Santa Barbara High School. That it makes a lot of sense. It's tangible. It's concise. It's something that the public can easily identify. And I cannot think of a higher priority in terms of facilities. So I would strongly support what Lanny said. Thank you.
Any other audience members who want to say anything? Yes.
Dr. Cash, members of the board, my name is Frank Stevens. I was a member of the Facilities Committee. What I have to say will be brief. I want to first say I'm not smart enough to go through everything that Lanny presents to you. I do agree with him on earlier bonds. I was here as an employee of the school district, and a lot of people were not happy with the fact they voted for bonds and things weren't accomplished. I am very pleased with the present bonds. I serve on both parcel tax and bond oversight committees, and I think those committees have had a great impact on being sure that the voters' wishes are being done, as you have said, Mr. Mayor. I'm going to say something to you that I'm sure the Facilities Management Committee is tired of hearing from me, but I want to share it with you. Having been in education for 35 years and continued for the last 20, trying to stay connected with schools and with school programs, I have two very high wishes. One is that we deal with priorities and we attach transparency to those priorities. And as I joined the Facilities Management Committee, I listened, looked at all the material, And I came back and said to my wife, there's something wrong here. It's getting just much too detailed, too confusing. People are asking questions and getting answers that may or may not be significant in the long run. So I went home and I said, what I have to do is look at my priorities. And I've said over and over to the facilities management, the first thing I think we want to ensure in all our schools is that they are safe and healthy school sites, no matter what we do. To me, that's the highest priority. Second, I went to the strategic plan that the school district has in place. And I looked at AIM 4, titled Facilities, which is what the Facilities Management Committee, I assumed, was going to focus on as priority and transparency. And I like the statement, create and maintain well-equipped and modern learning spaces. To me, children are in the classroom the majority of their time or in support spaces. And to me, if the strategic plan is to be followed, to create and maintain well-equipped and modern learning spaces is an obligation we have to the community. Then I looked and said, having been in schools, I know there's always deferred maintenance. We can plan ahead with a lot of that deferred maintenance to ensure and to enhance that schools are indeed safe and healthy school sites in our priority on maintenance, deferred maintenance expenditures. And finally, in keeping trust with our community, as it says in AIM 2 of the strategic plan, to make our schools community centers. Make sure the people, the public, the parents feel that that school belongs to them. And I will continue to share those thoughts with our facilities management people as we move forward. Not in the great detail, because I'm not totally convinced with what Lanny has said here yet, but I know that we have to focus more on prioritizing and developing a system of transparency such as our present oversight committees are doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your participation and your dedication. Yes, Mr. Ingalls.
Good evening, Dr. Cash, members of the board. My name is Mark Ingalls. I'm here tonight to, number one, applaud you guys for engaging in this process. This is an extremely important process, one that many people in this room have been involved in and participated in for many years. I, too, am very proud of our recent bond passage, the support from the community, and the commitment that the district has made to making good on all of the promises and specifics in those bonds. As I think we've done a good job. I, too, have served on those oversight committees, and I think it's been great. More importantly, I think what this whole process, the facilities process, has done is enlightened everybody on the fact that we have very important institutions doing a very important job, and we have a very expensive bill that comes along with that. And until such time that we can reprioritize our commitments as taxpayers and contributors to these types of facilities, we're going to always be behind the ball. I personally don't think that there's the political will and support today to pass another bond measure in the same light that we have in past years. I think it's going to be a new discussion. I think it's going to be a new focus and a new campaign. But it doesn't relieve us of the necessity to continue to engage the community in this dialogue. I think if we don't do anything for schools, the best thing we can do is continue to maintain the dialogue, maintain it transparent, maintain it as often and frequently as we can, and not in the sense that we need to put a new roof, the kids are leaking, we don't have lights at work. It's just that we're doing a fantastic job of educating our kids in our community with the resources and tools that we have. And we need to remind folks that we are. It isn't just a dollar sign attached to the progress and work that we're doing every day in our classrooms. So I think it's just imperative that we continue this dialogue, we continue to maintain and engage the public, specifically the non-schooled community. I don't know that they'll be the ones funding in the future directly and specifically with bonds as they have in the past, but we can be advocates for the need for those in our community that don't have people in school to stay and remain engaged in what the schools need to continue to educate our kids. There is no more precious resource in this country than young American minds, none. And I don't think you'll find an American, a taxpayer out there that would disagree. So we just need to keep it. And our school district's phenomenal, so we need to shine the light on what we're doing really well. I don't want to see us get discouraged by this daunting dollar sign that's in front of us for what we would, in a perfect world, like to have. Instead, we need to celebrate our successes. We need to continue to work diligently to try to stop the gap and hope that there's a turn of events that happens and takes place where there's a funding source for the future, a sustainable funding source for the future for our classrooms. We've got to hope that we do that. And I think to the extent that you guys can, we continue to advocate every day, whether it's the county level, the state level, the city level, for the need for the dialogue and the engagement by the community. So I would just encourage you to continue the good work that you guys are doing, and thank the committee members and the people in the community that are so passionate about making a difference in our community. It's time well spent, and I'm proud to be a part of this community, proud to have been a member of the school community, and look forward to continuing to work with the district for the future of our citizens and students. Thanks.
Thank you for all you've done for the parcel taxes. We've had 6 years and got 2 more to go, and they've been fantastic, and your leadership on the bond campaign was very much appreciated. Ms. Goodell.
Good evening. It's a little weird to be on this side of the podium. I'm succumbing to peer pressure because I really wasn't going to say anything, but I'm sitting back there, feel like the only one in the committee who's not speaking. But I did want to address a couple of things that have been said, and one had to do with why there was this sort of delay or interruption in how the committee was going forward, how the task force was sort of stopping and regrouping. And I think part of the concern among the task force was that we felt in many ways that we had sort of lost a clear sense of what our mission, our purpose, our function was supposed to be. And so I wanted to make sure that the board sort of understands how we came to feel that way, so that when you get the report, you can make sure that it's useful to you, that you're getting the information that you need in order to make the kinds of decisions that I know the board is going to have to make. One of the concerns that I felt as a member of the committee, and I think other people did too, it was expressed, was that there was so much to look at, and it really spans such a huge range that in trying to see everything at once, it really caused us to sort of not be able to focus on any particular thing. And what I mean by that, because it's not a criticism of the process, it's just a description of the amount of information that we're looking at, is that we were, on the one hand, looking at very practical things, like Mr. Stevens was saying about safety and security for our students. And then we were also looking at the schools had been asked to create sort of their best case scenario, their pie in the sky. If you had no limits, what would you want? And so we were looking at things that were just the ideal versus the most basic reality of what we needed. And in some ways, we were trying to figure out how to compare those against each other. And so it became a very difficult process, I think, as Lanny indicated at one point. We just felt like we were being asked to vote on items that we couldn't really grasp in terms of making a comparison among them. So I almost feel like the board would be well served if you kind of got pieces of it at a time to look at, instead of trying to see the whole thing at once in terms of what are practical necessities, priorities that we've talked about. And priorities was a big issue for the task force. The task force was fairly, I think, uniform in wanting there to be a set of priorities that we could all agree to. And I think that would be one thing that the board could look at. And then once you've kind of wrapped your heads around the priorities that would be imminent, then looking at, okay, once all of that is in place, where would we like to see ourselves in 50, 60, 100 years? But trying to do it all at once, I think, makes it really difficult, and especially if in the mix of that you're considering a bond, because I think that definitely, we have to be a little bit more realistic, as several people have alluded to. We're in a different bond climate now than even when our last one, where we were very successful. But I think the climate has shifted somewhat. And so it's going to be, I think that's going to be a more practical discussion, and then the more theoretical, sort of more hopeful discussion is going to have to take place also. But, and I would like to, I know you all know this, but just a reminder to the public that I think that the most recent bond measures have certainly been overseen extremely well. There's been, I know from having served on the board, that there was tremendous commitment on the part of the board to ensure that all of those dollars are being spent on exactly what the public was led to believe, and that some of those in the past where that didn't happen, it was outside the control of the district because state and national factors coincided to require us to have to spend it on, and some of it was even before the time I was there, but to require the district to have to spend that money in different ways that had not been in place. Those national and state factors had not been in existence at the time that the previous bonds were passed. So I'm a little concerned that the board continues to take hits on those, because I think that's undeserved. At any rate, thank you very much, and I appreciate being on this side, and it's nice to see you all.
Don't go away.
Thank you very much.
Can I just ask a point of clarification, and that this is based on what Dr. Ebenstein was saying before. When in this whole circles and stars stickers thing, what were you being asked to vote on? Was it a list, or was it the conceptual site plans, or?
Well, it was a little, to be honest, I think a lot of us weren't quite clear, because I think we kind of truncated that discussion before it got started, because so many of us felt uncomfortable doing it. So to be fair to the facilitators, I'm not sure they ever got the chance to fully explain to us what they were asking us to do. But to a certain extent, my understanding was that we were being asked to look at the individual site plans and identify those aspects of the plans that we thought were of particularly high priority or particularly solid request versus those that were not, or maybe not, maybe that's too harsh of a way of saying it, maybe just that were less so. And the objection that many of us raised at the time were that we felt like we were doing that too soon, that we hadn't set the overarching priorities yet that would guide our decisions before we were being asked to sort of compare. And some of us felt that it wasn't necessarily even the role of the committee to be comparing individual sites, that what we ought to be doing maybe more of was comparing types of priorities, and then have the district itself make decisions more about the actual site plans. But again, that was a discussion that wasn't held fully, because we had a great deal of discussion about whether we should go forward with the voting or not. And ultimately, pretty much reached consensus that we weren't really ready to do that. But that was why it got interrupted, because the task force felt that it needed to be. I think it was actually a very positive move on the part of Dr. Cash and on the part of our facilitator to, Kelly, to make sure that the committee's wishes were actually being heard and that we weren't being sort of coerced into moving forward when we didn't feel ready.
Yeah, I think it's, I really appreciate the committee standing firm on that and making that clear. So that's great.
Other questions? Thank you, Ms. Cordero.
Thank you.
I may have other questions as they pop up, but if I could start chiming in here. One thing I wanted to say, because it's come up a couple of times talking about maintenance, and just to be clear to the public that we have a separate maintenance master plan process, and I feel like, we often hear the public sort of combine the two things in terms of facilities master plans in terms of new buildings being needed or major renovations being needed, as opposed to sort of day-to-day maintenance that they don't see happening. And we really cut back on spending on that during the recession, and I feel like as a board we have been and need to continue, as we budget for the next couple of years, really go back and address that, because we see those holes and we know that our staff and our students are dealing with those on campuses every day.
And we are putting $1 million into
Yeah.
that fund.
Yeah, but honestly, it's going to take more than that. We raised this when we started the process, and what I've been hearing from the public outside of this group, because I feel like this group has actually really been part of the process and has a lot more detailed information, but the ones that have just taken like a look at this, and I think it would be good to go ahead and put up one of the conceptual site plans on the screen for the public to see. And it is, the ones from October at least are kind of buried on the website, but I think it's important that we have these linked to this agenda item, which they currently are not. So I think that would be good for the public to be able to take a look at that. On one side,
I can tell you that LPAs doesn't feel like they're ready for these to be, so that's why they haven't been.
right, but it is, legally,
will do
this
whatever
is
you would like to
information that we have access to, and therefore the public needs to have access to.
What are the dates of these documents we have in front of us? Are these the documents that we created last December? Or
Yes, December 2014.
So this is what the committee had?
No, they have
No?
not seen these.
Oh, okay.
So I think that people that have taken a look at the website and seen just the conceptual site plans, what we had said at the beginning of the process was these, we talked about being careful with the term conceptual site plan, because whatever we ended up deciding to do at any particular site, a site architect would come in and absolutely change that. And so, for example, we've had conceptual site plans for the Washington Library and the Adams Library, and they change, and they change, and they change, and the locations have changed, the layout has changed, and that has happened to every single conceptual architectural plan that we have. And so although obviously I feel that members of the public need access to this, it is an early stage, and I want to be careful that nobody thinks that, this would be like an approved plan, and therefore this is exactly what would happen on that campus, because, my concern with this, and members here have talked about this quite a bit, is when I see these, it is sort of a lot of what I think the site staff and families have said. This is exactly what we need. This would be, in the perfect world. I feel like a lot of what I'm seeing at this point anyway is not is anything we would ever have the money to do. And so I want to be so careful with whatever we present to the public finally, that it doesn't feel like we're promising something to the public, or that we're misleading the public with these conceptual site plans. I am much more interested in the things that, for example, Mr. Capps and Dr. Ebenstein and Ms. Cordero brought up with the idea of what's going on behind it. They've collected all this data. I mean, they've already talked to people. I want to know, what does each site need? What does it need? I'm more concerned with that, because I feel like we can move forward with that kind of information. It's the underlying information, and I'm sure that that's going to be there in their final report. It's just we haven't seen that.
Well, what they need will be dependent upon the direction you give me and staff. Because what they need is represented in the conceptual site plans.
Right, but it's not laid out in a way that because we would need the report, the plan that goes with it. So we don't,
There's narrative with all of it.
We need the narrative. That's not about like tearing down, like, if you're looking at Adams, you could see that, part of it would be tearing down some existing a classroom or two, where it's, I think that if we were ever able to pass a bond that were to replace portables, probably that site architects in that moment would say that's not the most cost-efficient way of doing this. And so I just want to be cautious about that, and I feel like the narrative is going to be more important than this layout. But having said that, I love the conceptual site plans in the sense that I have thought outside of the box on every single site. I have, they've had great ideas on many of the sites where I was like, oh, that would never have crossed my mind, but that is something that actually really helps here, and clearly certain sites, Adelante, oh, this is the only way that this could work. And so I have found the conceptual site plans helpful. I just want to be super cautious about it. And I agree with what a lot of the people have come up to say at the podium, and that is, we need to be conservative, and that the climate for what we can do for our students may be different now than it was in years past.
Anybody else?
Can I answer Ms.
Sure.
Iverson's question?
Yes. Go ahead.
We have approximately between 91 and 100 portables that are over 25 years old, out of a total of 163. And to clarify, the LPA was told unequivocally that all portables would be removed as part of any master planning process. There would be no portables remaining.
So that's including elementary, secondary,
Yes.
and elementary, or preschools also? Is that why that number is?
That includes Parma, which has 1, and it includes Las Flores, which has 2, and it includes Franklin's Child Development Program, which has 3.
Okay.
Ms. Limon?
Oh, yeah.
So I feel like these are a lot of conversations kind of happening all around one thing, because, I think of our intra-district transfer policy that we just passed and how that impacts facilities and our thought for growth or no growth in our district. So I think I mostly have questions that I'm throwing out that I'm pretty sure we don't have answers to for all of them. But one of the things that this board has also discussed, in addition to, I think a lot of us maybe feel portables are an absolute priority, but it also has to do with the spaces of other schools. And Adelante has been a big topic of conversation. And so I just think of what that means for the board as far as what are our priorities. And I don't think we're going to have that discussion tonight, but that's something else that I want to throw out there. In addition to portables, what else are our priorities? I think of the fact of what happens if there are competing bonds, not just locally, but at this, if there is also a potential bond in the future for facilities coming from the state. And then you have the flip. What if there is no bonds? How do we accomplish this? I just was reading something, I think this past week, where the governor was resistant to kind of move forward with a facilities bond at the state level, and kept kind of pushing it on LCFF, and that needed to be included in the LCAP. And so that brings up questions of, what does that mean for us, and how do we include it in the LCAP? Maintenance is one thing, but how do we think longer term? And for me, longer term also looks at, well, what happens 25 years from now? get excited looking at the conceptual site plans, but the first question is, how do we do this? And that's still not clear to me, that we even can do something like this. So then I step back of, well, then what next? If I don't think that we can do all of this, what next? So I don't know. I think I'm just mostly throwing thoughts that were raised by looking at these. I would agree with Ms. Parker that I think it's really important not to get people too excited, because we're not clear what we can do. We're not clear if that can happen in 10 years or in 20 years or in 5 years. But I also think that this gives us at least some direction to work towards. I think that the process was important, and it gives us some direction, and more direction than I had when the process started, of just what schools could potentially look like. I don't think I knew how to visualize that until this process. So I think it's been useful, but it then, of course, raises, I think, one of the bigger questions is of resources. How does all of this happen? So those are just some thoughts. Again, it's kind of just what's in my head as more as next steps. So.
Ms. Adelson?
Okay, I share with concerns of my fellow board members and also the presenters. Good input, very strong to hear what the committee has dealt with and ideas. I think one example that sort of keeps coming to my mind was at one of the presentations, the community meetings, and that was, I heard that on each site they wanted to bring food service capability into, have a cafeteria for some of these schools that have lost their cafeterias. And it made me wonder whether that's more cost effective. I know we say have kitchens at now Santa Barbara High that was just redone, and then Santa Barbara Junior High, and we ship to other schools. And so I think, yes, having a cafeteria, say at Roosevelt, put back, that would be a positive, but I don't know financially whether that's a positive. And then when I looked at where it was put in the plan, I saw where it was taking some of the lunch space. So I think there's so much to think about in terms of what we're proposing or what we're considering, and a lot of questions. That's what this process, just at this point, brought to my mind.
Dr. Paz?
I think, one of the things that we have to consider in the future is, a couple of people have raised is, so if not bonds, then what? If it's not that in the immediate future, how do we finance what we hope to achieve, if a small portion of what we're thinking about doing? And I think the other thing that was raised too, Ms. Cordero raised, was looking at this through the lens of types, prioritizing types of areas that we want to address first, and then looking at how that sort of impacts individual sites. Because that's an example, for example, the cafeteria piece. But I could look at it in different ways, like the portables is a huge example, it goes across. And I think that would be one approach to kind of think about how we first do our first cut across all of these facilities and prioritize that. And I think beyond that, though, we have to kind of really think about when we look at our numbers, we're pretty flat for the next conceivable short-term future. But beyond that, what are we going to look like? And I think that's something to consider when we look at our schools and we look at the impact they have right now. And I think Ms. Limon is bringing up point too, when we look at our charter schools, is that a future area that we need to prioritize? Let's just say we have more of an interest in charter schools in the future. I don't know. Is that something we have more of a desire, more people who want to attend our current charter schools? Do we look at that as another area? So I think having the lens of types of areas, maybe thinking about it in terms of principles that we work off of, that we use as our baseline, might be an approach to take. That we have a high priority over this and not so much over this.
I look at this as a process stage by stage. And it sounds so simple. We need to replace reportables. You just can't go in and take a portable out and put a building up. You know, that doesn't work that way. You need to know where you're going to build the building. You're going to put a two-story building, or how are you going to do it? You got to have a master plan, and I think that's what this process was supposed to develop, and it is, as far as I can see. As Ms. Parker said, it's not set in concrete, but it's a conceptual, if we were going to take out the portables, what would we replace them with? And where? A lot of buildings are moved around on these sites, so you just can't tear one down and put one up. But I think I fully expected this plan to go forward as conceptual, and at that point, and obviously the way this is done, we'd have to have, probably a $300 million bond or more. It's not going to happen, you know. But it's the same when we did the bond in 2010. We set a number based upon what we thought was realistic, and then we did priorities. We said, here's a whole laundry list of things we want done. What are the most important? And I think this would help us decide what was most important. And I think that's the job of the five of us, is to decide, number one, what type of bond, if we even go that direction. Would it be narrow? Would it be targeted? I think so. And then we'd have to say, okay, what can we do with that money? What are the priorities? That's not going to be easy. You know, it never has been. But I think we need the plan. I think we need the base plan in order to make those kinds of decisions. As I said, I was surprised that that process has stopped. Maybe I should have known that. But I think we are paying them good money to come up with a plan using their very best judgment based upon discussions with all parties. And I don't know where we stand and how to, I mean, I guess it said 60 days if we said go forward. I don't know how much we spent on that plan. I don't know what it would cost to stop that plan, or if we want to stop that plan. I personally don't want to stop the plan. I want to see a final product with all the background documentation that Mrs. Parker has mentioned.
Well, there would never be an intent to stop the plan. The interruption was based on members of the Facilities Master Planning Committee's request that there be more direction from the board as to whether it would be, as I stated in my opening, a more targeted, focused master plan, one for the next 10 years or so, or one that's more conceptual in nature from which the board would go through. If you go back and look at LPA's original proposals, you will note in there that part of that process is taking the board through priorities. Here's what we've learned in relationship to these major areas, one of which is portables. Health and safety is the #1 thing that Mr. Stevens commented on, and develop the list. So it really came down to more of a philosophical or directional request from me, moving forward with the original intent, or narrowing the focus down to something much more specific in relationship to a master plan. So the master plan would be all campuses, all the things that staff and the community had requested, which includes, as Dr. Ebenstein accurately pointed out, some large buildings on campuses, or it would be more targeted if the board was to direct staff to look at simply replacing portables. What would we put if we replaced all the portables? Would they be classrooms? Where would they be, et cetera? So what we need is direction from the board as to which way you want to go, and LPA is just waiting to hear, and they'll go whatever direction the board wants them to go.
Ms. Parker?
I think I have a question for Mr. Stevens, if you want to come on back up to the podium.
That's what I was afraid of.
Come back. And when you were speaking before, you were talking about your, bringing up the fundamental concerns beyond this sort of later piece of it in terms of developing a schematic. Do you feel like, and I think that I'm sort of getting the sense from committee members that not enough time has yet been spent, that maybe the committee needs more time on giving input and talking about the core principles of what and why, and that feels like maybe it's been moved along a little bit too fast. I mean, we have time. It doesn't need to be rushed. Is that what you're getting at, or do you feel like you've had the time?
I believe that the time exists. But as I said before, I'm not smart enough in all this to be able to give specifics all along the way. The word up there is conceptual site plan. To me, conceptual means it's close to being a reality. To me, the word proposed means I have the ability to make a number of changes if necessary. So I hope that the board gets something that's, quote, proposed with priorities that the Facilities Committee can look at, that Dr. Cash can share with us, and then we can move forward. I don't want to throw this out. A lot of time and effort and work has gone into it. But as a committee member, I want to know what are my responsibilities in establishing or helping to establish the priorities that will do what I said. Create and maintain well-equipped and modern learning spaces after the safe and healthy schools. And I know the district works very diligently on establishing safe and healthy schools, but you can identify some areas that are maybe at risk that you have to target. And beyond that, coming from an educational family, I know that my priority really is looking at how are those classrooms equipped? Are the children in an ideal learning environment? Are they all technology capable so that every classroom is in the 21st century and preparing for the next 25, 50, or 100 years, whatever comes on? I don't want to throw it out. The time exists. To me, it's proposed. Some schools want, I think the word was used, pie in the sky. I don't blame them. They were told to give all the things that they would like. It's the committee's job, and it's your job to narrow that down to something that's realistic and compatible with the strategic plan that the district has.
Thank you. So then I guess my question to the rest of the board is, do we want to see pie in the sky, or do we want it to come to us? And I think this is what Dr. Cash is getting at. Do we want them to have a little bit longer process with the committee where they take conceptual, move it more to proposed, and then do some priorities so that obviously we would make final decisions on priorities, but that is at least something that can come to us?
Ms. Limon?
I actually think it's useful, and to see both. I think pie in the sky was really good because it gave us an understanding of what in the ideal world it would look like. I think it would also now, as a next step, it would be useful to see a proposed. So what is, if we can't do this, what for the sites, what are what are the priorities within the ideals? But I also I think I don't hear any board member saying that replacement of portables is not a priority. And so because I don't hear board members saying that, I think that that's in the back of my mind as well, that how do we align anything that's proposed with the ideal, with also the fact that I'm not hearing folks oppose the idea that portables, I think, fall in line with the two priorities, Mr. Stevens, of health and safety and also modernized buildings. So how do we align these things?
Yeah. I mean, I would give just simply two examples of what might be considered pie in the sky, but I'm happy to see them on the plan. One would be a second swimming pool at San Marcos. That's probably pie in the sky. But I think it's good to see it on the plan because that may generate interested people at San Marcos to build a pool because there's a space for it. The other would be maybe the 3 gymnasiums at the junior high schools. That might be pie in the sky. But if they want to, if we may think differently when the time came to, depending on how much money we had. So I have no problem with the pie in the sky. I mean, pie in the sky is the eye of the beholder. You know, what is pie in the sky to me might be something very mandatory to you. And so I'd rather see the site plan include pie in the sky, because if you don't, all of a sudden you want a pool at San Marcos and no place for it. You know.
Mr. President?
Yes.
So kind of the original process was going to be to present a long-range facilities master plan drafted by a lot of input from the school sites, presented to you for your comment and approval. Then at some point in the year, if a decision was made to begin exploration of a possible bond measure in 2016, then to go to the facilities master plan, look at the plan, and make some very specific decisions about what we might bring forward for a conversation about what the priorities would be. My concern about asking schools to tell us what their priorities are would be we could end up with a priority at one school being not eliminating the portables because it's more important that this is done, and the priority at this school is to eliminate the portables. All of that may be good. You may say, well, we want every school to do their own thing. But it would be a much more difficult conversation to have in relationship to that as far as a district-wide facilities master plan. So the original intent was really just to bring forward a kind of a long-range view of what it could look like conceptually with 21st century learning, and then if it felt it was appropriate at some point to begin to have a public conversation about a potential 2016 bond measure, which I agree with all the speakers that it's extraordinarily important that the board is completely engaged in that a lot. And then have a more detailed and restricted and narrow conversation. One of the things I don't want to do, however, having said that, is have anybody that's participating in the process feel like they're wasting their time. And because to me that's, we have we got people that are still, 3 people still sitting here that aren't being paid to sit here, that are great members of our community, super supporters of public education, who have volunteered all their time to be kind of our experts, our community eyes. And I don't want to have them feel like their time is being wasted and not being valued, because to me, they got interrupted because it became very clear that kind of the big blue sky approach wasn't going to meet the needs of that committee. And so that's why I needed direction from you. The LPA, that was the path they were going down. That's the majority of the work's been done there. There'll be lots of debate over whether or not they should take this playground space or not take that playground space, or whether they should have a 2-story building or a 1-story building, or whether every school needs a science room. I mean, those are all things I would think you guys would ultimately decide. But all of the plans are based upon the input of the community, parents, staff, and the high school students. I mean, I think we had students from every high school on the Facilities Master Planning Committee that were probably some of the most articulate spokespersons, other than Dr. Ebenstein, advocating for their own campus and what they saw with the student interests. So I just want to do what's going to be best for you.
Ms. Limon?
And can I ask one more thing? So it sounds like we have, as a board, a pending discussion on a bond. But in addition to that, I mean, in the next month, what's already February? Yeah, in the next month, we're going to be talking about our LCAP. And so are there places where some of this can be included? And maybe the answer is no.
I'm afraid it is.
But I think it's worth also thinking about that, because I don't think that whether or not we go out for a bond, we are not going to have enough money to do everything that is needed or desired in our schools.
Correct.
So then the question comes is, where does this come in? And if it doesn't come in for LCAP now, does it come in for LCAP in 5 years? I mean, maybe the governor is going to change his mind on kind of the direction he's giving folks about, well, are there places in the LCAP to include some of this?
Well, my guess would be, and Ms. Shatek, you can correct me, I mean, what's the total amount of money we're getting through the LCAP process in our district?
106.
Which is not enough. I mean, so.
Well, 106
million.
That's through LCFF. I'm talking about what's the amount of money in the LCAP?
In the LCAP, it's just 5 million, 5.5.
And most of that's spent on meeting the needs of our English learner students, our economically disadvantaged students, and our 40 foster youth. So I think, what I heard the governor say, and and you're more in tune than I am, but my understanding of it was the governor was saying, this is not a state priority. We need to leave it up to local communities, so they need to pass bond measures to support facilities. Because I don't think the state's going to be able to put enough money into the LCFF to fund capital improvements.
Right, and so then how are we going to, in addition to the bond, which we already, one, we haven't made a decision on whether we're going to go out for a bond or not, but two, even if we do, I don't think we're going out for a bond that is going to be enough. So then that still means that as a district, we need to think about how we're going to fund some of the things that need to be done, but we won't have enough money for.
I agree.
Now, this is the long-range plan. Ms. Parker?
I just want to be careful in terms of the committee process, because when you're talking about things like advocating for playgrounds here and second-story classrooms there, I wouldn't want to do that as a board. I'm sure committee members want to look at big picture and not the micro details. They need to keep more at the macro level, and so I want to be cautious that it wasn't, because I could see if you got 21 school site plans and we're looking at those and saying, I could see that could be totally overwhelming.
Ms. Cordero alluded to that,
Yeah.
that the amount of information, and I believe very strongly, though no one will ever know, that if Dr. Evenstein hadn't raised his hand and said in that meeting, I've got some issues I want to deal with here before we do anything more, that I think I would have probably stopped the meeting along the way too, because it was way too much information all at once for people to try to even categorize in their head. And so there ended up being conversations, sidebar conversations about, well, I don't like the fact the parking got moved over there at this school, and I don't like...
It's too much.
Right, I agree, it's too much. And so going back to the Facilities Master Planning District Committee would have to be very specific instructions on what they would look at as opposed to individual school sites, and get their blessing on a much broader concept than on the individual details. But my point was toward, if we went back to school sites and said, hey, you tell us what's the most important thing, then I think we'd get exactly that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'll just make a comment is, again, when we get to the right point, the priorities are this board's decision, and based upon what's best for the district, not necessarily even handed across the school sites. What are the most priority items? Which portables have to go? Dr. Paz?
I would recommend that we look at that or send it back to the committee and have them make some broader recommendations in terms of the big pieces. Not obviously, as many of us are completely aware, we don't want to get in the minutia and the details, because that is no way. No one in this room could do that. And as much as we have people on board to do that, even they would be overwhelmed if they had to do it by themselves. So I think having those broader sweeps, talking about what it is that we want, coming back to the board, maybe looking at some principles we want to go forward with in terms of a number of years that we could all live with, and not necessarily get too much into the details, because I think, Mr. Herron was saying, well, one priority might be we do no more portables and we replace them with permanent buildings. Well, yeah, but there are details in that regard. But at least it gives us a place to land at, and I think that's good. It gives us, maybe we're not inside of the middle circle of the bull's, the bullseye, but we're getting closer. And I think doing that, would give staff enough direction and our consultants enough direction to start narrowing down that funnel and getting down to where we really want to be and where everyone could be happy with as much as we could get. And obviously it'd help us to make the decision. We go forward with the bond, we don't go forward with the bond, we look at other options, we stop and reassess whatever we would choose to do.
I would like to comment that this is the first time the question of a bond has even come up in our discussions that I know of. And so I don't want anybody to leave this, or watch this, or leave this room with the idea that we're talking about a bond at this point. And, because that's a whole different discussion, once you find out what the needs are. Anything else? Dr. Paz?
And I think that's an important point, because I made it earlier too, is that, we wanted to, and I made the point of saying we should look at, if it's not a bond, if it is a bond, beyond bond, what other options do we have as a school district to finance? I mean, I'm just putting it out there, because have we looked at everything? Can we look at something else? Are there alternative ways of financing? I don't know. Maybe we should look at that as well.
Well, an issue that could come up, I was just thinking about it, we have made the decision to put more money into maintenance. We have talked about the decision to absorb the parcel tax into our budget. I mean, you theoretically could say, let's go for another parcel tax and take the money that we have and use it for facilities that is going to be used to replace the parcel tax. That's a whole discussion, too, that could possibly be.
And I think one of the things that I think a couple of us went to the CSBA session on refinancing bonds. That's another thing I think we need to, if we were to come back as a discussion of bonds, looking at that as a starting point as well, just looking at what we currently have as obligations, maybe freeing that up and thinking about moving forward from that point as well.
Anything else?
May I ask one more question?
Yes.
Would the board be interested in seeing cost estimates of the conceptual?
Oh, yeah.
Mr. Herron?
To what detail? I mean, that's like asking, you start with the little thing up here by us, say, yeah, we'd like it. By the time you get down to the bottom circle, you got somebody running around for eons trying to come up with those numbers on every single detail. I mean, I think a general topic of how much money do they think is involved in this?
Yes, that's what you would get.
Yeah, okay, not a detailed. I don't.
No, we wouldn't say it's going to cost X number of dollars per door. But we would say, I believe we would say, here's what the estimate is for eliminating portables.
Yeah.
Here's what the estimate is for all the health and safety walkways, gates, and fences.
Yes, that'd be fine.
Okay, great. That we can do.
Further? Thank you very much. We appreciate your offer to talk to us, and we appreciate the fact that you did. Thank you.
And have faith that you'll keep it up.